Welcome to Renegading. Margaret Thatcher is undoubtedly one of the most divisive people in British political history. But whatever you think of her, she's a woman whose economic policies still reverberate today. She'll always be known as someone who loved the tenuous idea of linking property ownership to democracy, who valued the economy over society and thought that a big bang liberation of the City of London would deliver untold riches for everyone. But in reality, after 40 years of Thatcherism, the UK now presides over austerity, a private debt explosion, financialization, privatization, deregulation, inequality, and extortionate monopolies. So, when a proposal to build a Margaret Thatcher museum was put forward, many British people asked, why do we need a Thatcher museum? Aren't we living in it? Joining me to discuss whether we are living in Thatcher's museum are the authors and economists Grace Blakeley and James Meadway. Welcome to you both. James, if we are going to depict Margaret Thatcher today as this historic character, the Prime Minister, Iron Lady and all the rest of it, let's look at her economic legacy to begin with. Do you think she knew what she was doing when she was pushing through the economic reforms?
She thought she knew what she was doing. Her vision of what the world would look like once you had cut trade unions down to size, as she would see it, privatised a load of things, given everybody their own home. The version of capitalism she wanted to get to, I think, would be quite different in that we'd have much more manufacturing. We wouldn't have a huge financial system that sort of dominates and cloaks absolutely everything else. We wouldn't have households that are just about the most indebted of the major large economies. That's what we have in Britain. I mean, Thatcher never stood for these things. She was all about everyone must live within their means. We all must, only spend what you can afford. You don't go off borrowing like crazy. You don't run up credit card bills. You don't have a form of capitalism that's so financialised, as Grace would no doubt call it, that you have capitalism that's really productive, that people are making things and Britain's exporting, doesn't run a huge trade deficit. So almost all of this is not what she wanted to get to.
Right, so what happened?
What happened, I think, is the key bit is that she set off with a plan to try and reshape British industry in the first instance. So you shake out trade unions, you break them up, you cut them down to size, you introduce legislation to massively reduce the power of trade unions in the workplace, you reassert management control in quite a key way in lots and lots of different workplaces. You do the same thing in the public sector. So you take all of this on, you shake out costs, and you come out of it with a much leaner, more efficient, battle-ready capitalism that can take on the world. That's clearly the image that they have of what's going on here. It's going to be the entrepreneurial spirit, right? All of this stuff. Britain is a workshop of the world again.
But they treat the state as an entrepreneurial exercise, if you like. If a corporate, a lean, mean corporate.
Yeah, well, this is the bit that neoliberalism is different from classical liberalism. Is that it says basically there is a role for the state, and the state is there to sort of crush the saboteurs, to coin a phrase from a couple of years ago. It's there to take on trade unions. It's there to break up these illicit monopolies that form otherwise. It's there to actually intervene and make a market economy work. And they try all this, and there is a big shakeout of British industry in particular. There's millions of manufacturing jobs go. There's plant closures. It's decimation of British manufacturing in the early 1980s. But what replaces it is this peculiar new service economy with finance at its centre. They deregulate finance. It balloons enormously. It becomes the leading sector of the entire economy. And this gradually bends the entire rest of the British economy around what finance wants. And that's what we end up with.
Thatcher may not have intended to create the kind of economy that she did end up creating, but that almost just proves the extent to which it doesn't really matter what you think you're doing. What matters is whose interests you're acting in. And, Thatcher may have had a plan for, she did have a plan for kind of shaking up the unions, for re-energising British capitalism, for boosting entrepreneurship, creating a nation of homeowners, etc., and thinking that that would be a very prosperous, dynamic and kind of, in her view, her understanding of fairness, fair society. But ultimately, the reason that she thought all those things was because she was linked to and kind of influenced by a set of interests that had a very particular view of what they wanted from the economy, which was things like, the removal of restrictions on capital mobility, the deregulation of finance, the kind of opening up of British capitalism to the rest of the world, privatisation, etc., because those people knew that they would make money from that process. So the kind of visions and the rhetoric that Thatcher had around what a kind of, a free economy and a strong state would mean are in many ways secondary to the question of the class interests that she was acting in.
You can't mention those interests without mentioning Milton Friedman, the Chicago Boys, Reaganomics. That was the prevailing economic thought at the time. Why was that the case then? And why did business embrace that so wholeheartedly?
The reason it was so powerful was that there was a mix of really quite profoundly committed ideologues, like Hayek and to a lesser extent Friedman, who saw the USSR, the growth of kind of communism, of central planning, as a real affront to human freedom, and a set of interests who just had a purely material interest in these ideas being pushed and pushed forward. And I kind of see a parallel development with the rise of Keynesianism and the adoption of social democracy and development of it by, for example, the Labour Party. Keynes is this ideologue who, Jeff Mann argues is committed to kind of saving civilization and therefore saving capitalism. And his ideas are taken up by various parties that represent the interests of organised labour because his ideas will support and reinforce the interests of the class that this particular political project is representing. And I think you can see a similar development in similar parallels with the development of neoliberalism. You have ideologues, intellectuals who are really quite seriously engaged in this intellectual enterprise, which again, Slobodian and then people like Murawski detail very clearly, this intellectual enterprise. But it was also linked to a very particular political project, which was a combination of kind of international financial elites, business elites, and particular set of politicians who did want to see a world where capital was free to move around, where investors' rights were protected, where, the state played a much smaller role in the economy, where unions weren't free to disrupt the market mechanism as they saw it. And those two groups of people ended up coming together to create an incredibly powerful political project that took advantage of a crisis that ended up taking place in British and global capitalism in the 1970s to push forward their agenda. That's,
as the corporates would say, a 35,000-foot view, right?
Yeah.
But when we look at it at the householder level, what's really happened in the UK is a so-called nation of shopkeepers became a nation of estate agents, buy-to-let landlords and property owners.
Well, I mean, not quite a nation. If you look at the sort of distribution of wealth that you get under Thatcher, I mean, the ideal is what they talked about, a property-owning democracy, that everybody would end up owning shares, everybody would be their own sort of little capitalist. What actually happens, I mean, the striking one is individual ownership of shares, which in the late 1970s, early 1980s, as Thatcher comes to power, it's 40% of shares in Britain are owned by individuals. If you look today, it's around about 10, 12%, right? So none of this really happens in the way that the ideology...
It looks wonderful on a drawing board, this.
Well, exactly. It can look wonderful on a drawing board and everybody can take their own different parts of it. What I think and I don't think Grace is quite saying this, but I think there's a danger in thinking, here is the blueprint that the Mont Pelerin Society provided in 1947 or whenever it was set up. And then it was just implemented by Thatcher from 79 onwards. You end up with a much weirder story. I mean, a lot of the deregulation of finance, in particular, sort of cross-border international finance, its ability to trade out of the country, in and out of the country, that was already happening under the Labour government. And then Thatcher, I think, started to provide a story about what more you could do and where we might get to. Right. It still wasn't where you got to, but it was a story. That point is really important because it shows the extent to which, any capitalist model, whether kind of neoliberal, Keynesian, whatever, will be shaped by, primarily the struggle between different class forces that is taking place within it, rather than simply the kind of institutional framework that's been set up in order to contain it.
Is what you're saying, that there are the mega trends in place because of vested interests and a class system and whatever that might be, actually they just get supercharged? Well,
there's a combination of both. I mean, take the Eurodollar market, right, which is the first sort of appearance from the 50s onwards of a kind of offshore trading zone for dollar loans and savings in dollars. So he was outside of the control of the US. So he was offshore for the US, based in London. The reason that grows up here is because Harold Wilson, who later went on to be Labour Prime Minister in the 60s and 70s, when he was President of the Board of Trade, deregulated banks and said, you're allowed to trade dollars here. Now, that was not in the anticipation that this would then slowly balloon into this sort of monstrous thing that is the City of London. That was not why he did it. I mean, the other detail in that one is part of the reason the market grew up is because the Soviet Union at the time wanted somewhere to put its dollars that was outside of American control. So there's any number of different
all
intentions.
These different things coming in. Because also there's the triumphalism, if you like, of beating the Soviet Union, of saying, actually, capitalism reigns supreme. We've seen off the arch enemy. Yeah. What you're both saying is that these mega trends, all these things filter in. Actually, it's a moment in time. She was at the helm at that time. you have to admit, though, she did supercharge it because, I mean, if we do look at the private debt specifically, 1984 onwards, we get that massive ballooning up to the crisis.
It's still, I mean, there's a ballooning up to the crisis and recession 89, 90. It's nowhere near as high as what you get to in 2007, 2008, partly because you didn't have so long to continue. And also, I think the sophistication of the financial system to just produce more and more debt and think it was manageable.
Does she want that? You know, as a prudent shopkeeper's daughter, as she marketed herself as, does she want all this private debt everywhere?
She'd take it. She didn't want it, I don't think, but she'd take it. I mean, after what looks like an absolute car crash, I mean, bear in mind the amount of pressure Thatcher was under to deviate from a course in the early 80s. She was incredibly unpopular right the way through, really, to the Falklands crisis. Had a series of major battles, not just the obvious ones with trade unions and Labour and everybody else, but also, you know, against the Wets in her own cabinet. She was in a minority position inside her own cabinet for much of this period of time, in effect. She had a battle with the CBI. The CBI didn't agree with what she was doing. It was everybody all the time, and she sort of ploughed through it. So by the time you get to the sort of mid-80s, you start to generate a boom. You know, the Lawson boom, you cut interest rates, you cut taxes. It works very well for a few people. If you're in work, I mean, finally, real wages start to pick up a bit. If you're out of work, you're done for, you're stuffed, and great swathes of the country see none of this. But of course you take it, because it looks like it's economic growth and something's happening, and suddenly your so-called revolution is starting to work.
Things can only get better. It can only get, take it all from me, you know, I know that things can only get better. It can only get better. Now I found you.
She once said, very quietly, that when asked what was her great achievement, she said New Labour. And the thing is that things don't always get better if you're on a race to the bottom. True?
Yeah, I mean, I think in many ways, the New Labour position was defensible at that point in time because it seemed as though things were only going to get better.
But again, that's the private debt taking off again in a monumental way.
They had absolutely no idea that was the case. I think if you went back to 1997, you can imagine people like Francis Fukuyama are saying it's the end of history. The great ideological battle between left and right is finally over. Capitalism has won. This is, you know, the end, as it were. Growth is booming. Yes, of course, that's being driven by private debt levels. But most people don't really understand the kind of importance of that. You have this kind of massive wave of globalization, which is both bringing in consumer goods for the rest of the world and pushing this narrative of modernization, that history is now a question of the rest of the world catching up with the US and the UK and other parts of the global north, and that is going to be facilitated by more and more globalization. And, you know, things will only get better and better and better. There was this idea that they'd tamed the business cycle through inflation targeting. And yes, all of these things turned out to be completely and utterly false, but it was very fitting with the kind of millenarian mood of the time. And it was, you know, even more so given that it was kind of coming up to the end of the century. So I kind of understand, you know, in many ways, the assumption that most people had that things would only get better and better and better. And actually this was prevalent on the left as well. We know now, in hindsight, that that was all premised upon, you know, this massive accumulation of debt, which ultimately burst in this huge crash in 2008. And that completely changed the parameters for political discourse and everything else. What is not defensible is people who, having witnessed and lived through that, continue to cling to this idea, this very unique economic moment that created a very unique political moment, which basically said that we aren't changing any of the kind of basic structures or parameters upon which economic growth depends. We're just going to play around inside this little box, which is kind of, you know, this particular form of capitalism. We're going to try and make it a little bit less unfair. And, you know, that model is only going to get stronger and stronger and stronger. Thinking like that is no longer defensible after the financial crisis, which is why liberals and centrists, or however they want to describe themselves, are increasingly becoming out of touch with most of the population because they're clinging on to this 90s, noughties ideology that has absolutely no place in a kind of post-crash economy.
Welcome back to Renegade Inc. Before we talk more about whether the UK today is actually Thatcher's Museum with Grace Blakeley and James Meadway, let's have a look at what you've been tweeting about in this week's Renegade Inc. Index. First up, from We Own It, it's the product of 40 years of Thatcherism, a decade of austerity, decades of perception that private is good, public bad, and that any public service is unlikely to be what you really want. This is a piece from Natalie Bennett.
The National Audit Office recently released a report showing that, some PFI schemes had ended up being 40% more expensive than if public financing had been used. This has nothing to do with efficiency and everything to do with taking, a state expenditure which would, involve borrowing and an outlay of spending at the moment and paying that back over a period of time, and taking that, putting it into the private sector and allowing, therefore, private investors to profit from that process.
Next, from Dominic Brown, with neoliberalism ailing and the right bereft of other economic ideas, the left's new economics may have a long future, whether or not Corbyn's Labour Party wins power. To borrow a line from Thatcher, there's now an alternative.
The big argument there is that, like Thatcher, but obviously for good rather than evil purposes, this is about ownership. So Thatcher's big thing, or one of her big things, but probably the centre of it, is a big shift in ownership. She privatises great chunks of what the government used to own. She introduces right to buy, so shift of the housing stock towards sort of private ownership, popular capitalism, shareholding democracy. This is the rhetoric, doesn't really happen. What we want and what we ought to put at the centre of a sort of alternative to that is a shift in the other direction. So instead of everything privatised, you say, how do we turn things into forms of collective or communal ownership?
Next, from Prem Seeker, tax cuts for the rich promised by Boris Johnson and Jeremy Hunt have been attacked by the UN rapporteur on extreme poverty, who compared them to Donald Trump's fiscal policies and warned that they would, quote, tremendously increase inequality in Britain. How much do we need to say about this?
Well, he's just stating the obvious,
Right.
but it will be denied. I mean, isn't he the same guy who had Philip Hammond insisting that there weren't millions of people living in poverty in Britain?
Quite where Philip Hammond lives. Well, actually, I know where he lives.
Which is it's not somewhere with millions of people in poverty right in his doorstep, shall we say. Although, how you managed to get into Parliament or the Treasury, where he presumably works, without seeing at least some evidence of that poverty is quite beyond me.
Finally, from Gill, on a mission, austerity does not promote growth or reduce deficits. It is bad economics. It's also a public health disaster. It is not an exaggeration to call it economic murder. Now, they're pretty strong words, but this is commenting on the study that links UK austerity to 120,000 deaths.
I think this is an interesting thing about the kind of political economy of austerity, because it is an attempt to kind of continue the power relations upon which financial capitalism rests, right? But, you have this big crisis of capitalism. Austerity is used as a mechanism to ensure that that crisis does not become a full-fledged kind of confrontation over the future of the capitalist system, because it's used to weaken labour with a small l to such an extent that that pushback is muted. But we're now getting to a point where the kind of constituency that usually elects the governments that are pursuing austerities is actually being harmed by those policies. And I think that's at least partly why those alternative strands of economics are becoming more popular.
So normally you have Book of the Week. We've got two books this week. Grace, your forthcoming book is called Stolen: How to Save the World from Financialization. Pitch it to us, but in 25 seconds.
Right. It is a kind of overarching political economic history of the UK that really goes back in earnest to the 1980s, when I argue that this new growth model called finance-led growth started to really begin in earnest, though its roots lie a little bit further back. It looks at how that growth model has changed various different aspects of the economy, so businesses, households, the state, and our relationship with the rest of the world, how it collapsed in 2007, and how the collapse of that growth model, understood as kind of, the death of the old before the birth of the new, has been able to come about, explains a lot of the problems with our economy today. So kind of low productivity, low wages, etc.
Perfect. Historical context.
Yeah. And how to get out as well, because it is called How to Save the World from Financialization.
Helpful. Really helpful. James, you've got a book, but not yet a title. Nor even a working title.
Slightly hypothetical, but really it's an attempt to write out, I mean, after a few years working for John McDonnell and been involved with the kind of Corbyn movement and this sort of thing, to write out what it is that we want and what it is that we're trying to do. So sort of building on some of the things Grace talks about what a mess the economy is. The next question is, well, what do you do about it, and what are the strands we need to pick on? We were talking about it earlier, some of the stuff around ownership, much broader set of ownership, some things around changing how people work and how often they work, understanding what things like artificial intelligence and data will do to change our economy and how we might shape that for the public good. So those are the sets of themes, I think, coming through in the thing. And climate change, obviously.
Wonderful. A lot of the stuff that we talk about, ultimately economic policy moving through, the political realm and then being implemented. How many times do economists, policymakers, politicians and the rest of it sit down and say, we can see the manifestos and all the rest of it and the stats, no one's really decided on what kind of society we want to live in? So is it that in economics now we've got a total failure of imagination? Because ultimately what we need to do is come up with a creative design brief to say this is what voters would like. And this is ultimately going to give them a better quality of life and the ability to express themselves. Yeah. How do we begin to talk like that and start to sell that idea so people can genuinely get involved and say, this is what I want? This
is almost the fundamental sort of political problem we're up against, which is the kind of failure imagination, if you like, the collective failure to see beyond what we have at the minute. I remember, going back a bit, István Mészáros, who's a Hungarian philosopher, doing a talk, this must have been 2009, just after the crash really erupted, and he said, look, the problem we have at the minute is the choice is socialism or barbarism, but without the option of socialism. Right? so which is quite a bleak way of looking at it. But there is something to that. We need to reconstruct the idea that things could be different, that there is an alternative, despite what Thatcher and the other ideologues would claim about it.
But the interregnum bit, which is the old's dying and the new can't be born, we actually fished out a picture from Australia, I think it was. I think a senator over there, he chose not to swear on the Bible, but swore on Milton Friedman's book about capitalism and freedom. I mean, the want for political expediency and the wholesale belief in these ideas, these Friedman-esque ideas, is that a massive barrier to progress when we try to reimagine the future, to have lives that are meaningful?
Yeah, completely. I think this goes back to, so my publisher, Repeater, has recently published the kind of collective works of Mark Fisher, who famously wrote about capitalist realism. The idea that I think is actually a quote that goes back to Frederick Jameson, that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism.
Gosh, cheering. Lovely stuff.
And for a long time, that was really, as I was explaining before, that period between 1989 and 2007 when history was over, there was no alternative, capitalism had won, things could only get better. There was this really pervasive sense that there was no alternative to capitalism, not simply because there was no political movement to push against that, but because they literally could not imagine a world which could be better and not be capitalist. And again, that was based on some very unique historical economic conditions, which are now over. And I think we really have started to see the death of capitalist realism in the period since the financial crisis. It did not happen immediately after Lehman Brothers collapse. It would be bizarre to expect that it would. No one knew how the period after the crisis was going to play out. But, 10 years into austerity and, with an economy that is just not working the way that it should, the way that people have expected it to over the most of their lives, with intergenerational equality massively increasing, wealth inequality, all these different inequities. And that has both contributed to the emergence of a movement to replace capitalism with socialism and has been based on the emergence of that movement.
Right. There's still a fight over what capitalism looks like after neoliberalism is roughly what we're dealing with. The disintegration of how the world economy is supposed to operate. The fact you have the two largest economies on the planet going ding-dong at each other over a trade war, over really quite a weird trade war. It's often about intellectual property and all sorts of other things. So that's neoliberalism as a big global organising thing, really crumbling away in front of us. The space is there to organise different things, but how it gets organised and for whom it gets organised is the question to get into. Donald Trump has his own version of what that organisation looks like. It would not be one that I'd support and Grace supports and lots of other people support.
But Bernie Sanders has that vision also.
Well, there's a different vision of it. It's like the vision is either, we are going to sort of hyper-excited national capitalism that will work very definitely for few people at the top, and maybe that'll turn to something everybody else, and here's a bunch of racism to make it all look fair. Bernie Sanders has something quite different to that. And I think what you've got with Jeremy Corbyn's Labour in Britain is something quite different to that as well, much closer to Bernie Sanders, and saying, actually, we can make the economy, to coin a phrase, work for the many, not the few. And that's what we need to get to. And climate change, yes, the overwhelming problem you run up against, the bit that accelerates all of this, the bit that forces all these questions in a really dramatic way, is the fact we now have to deal with a world that's visibly and obviously getting getting warmer and all the consequences of that.
Give us a couple of policy ideas that you would back as absolute bankers, probably not best uses that term, but absolute winners that you know that you could get behind and a lot of other people get behind to begin this conversation.
Okay, well, I really like the idea of reductions in working time. We've had a 5-day working week stuck there really since the 20s and 30s. It's just taken as read as this is what we do. I think if you want to give people more freedom, if you want to give people more choice over what they're doing in their lives, you take them out of what are increasingly spaces where they work, where they have almost no control at all. I mean, you've seen the Amazon patent where you're monitoring someone's movements the whole time. If you're on a 0 hours contract, you have almost no control over that. So if you can plausibly give people their time back, that is a major, major achievement for them. We ought to be looking at something like this.
Wonderful. Grace, so one proposal from you that you can absolutely back and you know would go out there and make an immediate impact.
One of the biggest kind of idea that I put forward in my book is basically about a kind of intermediary step moving towards socialisation of ownership. And it is to create something called a people's asset manager, which would essentially act alongside a national investment bank to manage collectively owned assets, be that sort of nationalised land. You'd maybe capitalise it with some of the bonds through the QE programme. You'd add in various socialised or collectively owned assets that, would have been created by that time. And you would invest alongside the National Investment Bank. You would use the kind of resources in that asset manager to invest in companies that the National Investment Bank had lent to. And in doing so, you would slowly get to a situation where this kind of people's asset manager, owned more and more in terms of equities, shares in companies in various parts of the economy. And that then starts to reduce the section of the economy that is controlled privately and increase slowly and steadily as the economy grows, the section that is owned collectively and socially. Eventually you get to a point where that thing can start, paying out dividends or doing something that would actively kind of change people's lives. But I see that as a kind of the use of the tools we have available to us now in order to kind of take a step towards basically socialism.
And let people then dream about how the future could be different if that initial step is taken.
And the first thing, obviously, is just breaking the hegemony of private ownership over the most important resources.
You want to give people more time to express themselves. You want to invest in the real economy. A pair of lunatics. Absolutely. Optimistic?
It's perilously easy to fall into the trap saying everything is bad and we can do nothing. What's hopeful at the minute is a sense for a very large number of people that they can do something, whether it's Extinction Rebellion, whether it's a load of people joining the Labour Party and supporting Jeremy Corbyn. There's all sorts of things happening. There are good reasons to hope.
I think it's the duty of socialists to be optimistic. And I think, the thing that makes me most excited at the moment is the general uptick in concern about the environment. And that has been something that has come up surprisingly quickly, that's taken a lot of people by surprise, and that really is kind of upsets the assumption by most people that actually people just don't care about the environment because it doesn't affect them and their lives. If we are able to think differently about the world, about the potential, about the future, then we can start to kind of challenge what seem to be kind of completely dominant structures of thinking and institutions and start to build something new.
Wonderful. Grace, James, thank you both very much for your time. That's it from Renegade Inc. this week. You can drop the team a mail, studio@renegadeinc.com, or you can tweet us @Renegade Inc. Join us next week for more insight from those people who are thinking differently. But until then, stay curious.